To better understand what is going on between Israel and Hamas, you have to understand a little bit of the history, and that's what I'm talking about on this episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. Hamas and Israel are currently at war with each other. It's been all over the news, and we as Americans really don't understand why it's going on. And I'm really shocked and a little bit appalled at the fact that there are pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas protests going on in America right now, because it's just ridiculous. There is no way you can support Hamas in this war. There's just not. But to better understand why they're fighting in the first place, first we have to look at the history of the Jewish people. And I'm not going to turn it into a Sunday school lesson, but I'm going to run through it pretty quick, just to bring us up to the 20th century. The Jewish people were founded by a man named Abraham. Abraham was living in an area of the Middle East near Babylon. And the modern city of Baghdad now sits on the ruins of the ancient city of Babylon. I just throw that in for free, because a lot of people don't realize that Baghdad and Babylon are the same geographic place and the ancestral home of the Babylonian people. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the Jews. Well, Abraham was living in an area near Babylon. God spoke to Abraham and said, I want you to leave the country that you were born in. I want you to leave the land of your fathers and go to a place that I will show you. So Abraham and his wife and his servants, the people who worked for Abraham, all loaded up and started heading west. God tells Abraham to go up on top of a mountain. And he says, everything you can see, north, south, east, and west, as far as you can see, from the top of this mountain, I will give to you and your descendants forever. This is what God told Abraham. And at the time, it was commonly referred to as the land of Canaan. This is where the Canaanites lived. And there were a bunch of people, various cultures, that comprised the Canaanites. And if you remember anything from Sunday school, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Philistines, they were all Canaanites. But God told Abraham that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them this land as an inheritance forever. Now, if you don't believe the Bible, that's fine. The Jews do believe it. Not to belabor the Old Testament point too much. Basically, eventually, Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob, with the help of his mother, tricked his father Isaac into giving him the inheritance, the full inheritance, instead of Esau. And if you know the story of Jacob's ladder, God spoke to Jacob in a dream where he saw a ladder extending from earth to heaven and angels going up and down. And he said, you have the same promise of Abraham. Your descendants will inherit this land. And from this day forward, your name will no longer be Jacob. From this day forward, your name is Israel. So all the descendants of Jacob became known as the Israelites. And I won't get into why they're called Jews instead of Israelites. But anyway, this is where the Israeli people came from. The Jewish Israeli people. I won't get into the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors, but ultimately, the Jews became slaves to the Egyptians. The Egyptians held the Jews in slavery for about 400 years. 400 years is a long time. Well, after about 400 years, there came a man on the scene named Moses. Moses is the main character in the story of the Ten Commandments. God spoke to Moses out of the burning bush, said, "Go to Pharaoh, tell Pharaoh, let my people go." And finally, Pharaoh released the Jews from Egyptian slavery. And just like God had told Abraham 400 years earlier, go to a land that I will show you. Keep walking till I tell you to stop. So they finally get to the land of Canaan. And God says, this is the land that I promised to Abraham, go and possess it. And Moses didn't get to go possess the land, but he passed his blessing on to Joshua. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and many, many other battles, and basically they took over the land of Canaan. Or at least in their heads, they took over the land of Canaan. But see, there was a problem with the land of Canaan. There were already people living there. The Hittites and the Amorites, and various and sundry other Canaanites. And there was also a group called the Philistines. They never completely took over the land of Canaan. And the one that gave them the most trouble was the Philistines. And see, by the time the man who would ultimately become King David, when he was a little boy, the Israelites were fighting yet another battle with the Philistines. And the Philistines had this giant named Goliath. And David said, I think I can take him. And we know the story. David killed Goliath with a slingshot. So David became the most well-known and most beloved of all the kings of Israel. And the first temple, which is where the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem is today, was the site of the first temple. It was actually built by Solomon, David's son. But anyway, let's fast forward. Over many, many years, there was infighting between the Jews. The tribe of Judah decided it was the strongest and decided to separate from the rest of Israel. So there was a divided kingdom. There was a separation between Israel and Judah. Over time, the Assyrians took them over. The Babylonians took them over. The Persians overthrew the Babylonian Empire. And they became subjects of Persia. Then along comes Alexander the Great. And various other conquerors came along. Well, about 60 years before the birth of Jesus, the Roman Empire takes over basically all of the people and land around the Mediterranean. They take over Greece, they take over what is now Lebanon, Egypt, everything. And then Jesus is born. Well, at the time of Jesus, the land we now call Israel, it's labeled Israel on the map, was actually a province of Rome, and it had its own governor, a guy named Pontius Pilate. You may remember him from your Sunday school lessons. Well, the Romans relabeled the map, and they called this area that we now call Israel Palestine. The Romans were the first ones to use the word Palestine to refer to this region of the world, which for a couple thousand years was called Canaan. The Romans called it Palestine. And the word Palestine was on their map because it was the Latin pronunciation of Philistine. See, the Romans didn't care about the Jews at all. They were just yet another conquered people who are now under their control. And the Romans called them all Philistines or Palestinian. They made no distinction between Jews and Canaanites. They were all the same to them. Didn't care. Well, about 30 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, this group of Jewish people decided that the Romans were no longer welcome there. And they decided that they would fight back and try to drive the Romans out of their homeland. Well, they failed. The Romans killed over 1 million people 2,000 years ago. 1 million people is a lot of people today. But some historians estimate that the Romans killed about 1 million people and captured and enslaved almost 100,000 more. And basically told them that they were no longer welcome in their homeland. And the last major battle, or the last notable major battle, was when the Romans took Masada. It's a big rock out in the middle of Israel, and there was a big Jewish temple up on top of it. And that's where they all fled to because they said the Romans will never get us out of here. Well, they were wrong there too. So for the next few hundred years, the Romans were in charge of Israel, which was now called Palestine, and they drove the Jews out. Well, to fast forward again, over time, the Roman Empire started to have its own problems, and they split into two separate kingdoms. And by now, the Jews are spread all over Russia, all over Europe, all over the rest of the world. The Romans had told them, you can't come back here. You are no longer welcome in Palestine. This was the Romans that told them, not the Palestinians. Well, about 300 years after the Jews were exiled from Palestine, there came this new emperor, the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, a man named Constantine. They named a city after him, called it Constantinople. And he decided that the whole Roman Empire should convert to Christianity. And the Holy Land, where the original Temple of Solomon was, and where Jesus was crucified, and where the empty tomb was, all of that stuff became Christian Holy Land. And the Romans decided it must be preserved. Well, around the same time that the Romans became Christian, along comes this prophet named Muhammad. So Muhammad says, God's angel has told me that because the Jews and the Christians have both turned their backs on him, that now God, the one God that they called Allah, that was their word for God, Allah has decided now that the new chosen people of God are Arabs. He has turned his face away from the Christians and the Jews and turned his face toward you. And you are also descended from Abraham through his illegitimate son Ishmael. So therefore you have the same promises as the children of Ishmael that the children of Israel have. And you are now God's chosen people. Well, as you can imagine, throughout the Middle East, this religion spread very quickly among the Arab people through regions now that we have names for, like Saudi Arabia Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. The people who lived in these areas were very, very receptive to this new message from Muhammad. And over the next 400 or so years, as the Romans kind of went away, and there was never another Western kingdom strong enough to take over all of the Mediterranean, it kind of fell to this new religion started by Muhammad, and they call themselves the Nation of Islam. Well, the Nation of Islam moves into Spain, Northern Africa, so they're kind of pushing into the European sphere, and they kind of got pushed back a little bit, but they didn't go away. They were still there. It's just there was nobody in the West who could fight them. They could push them back to the Middle East where they came from, but they didn't have the manpower or the ships or anything else to go over there and really mount a war until the Christian Crusades began 1,000 or so years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And there was a pope who told all the kings in Europe, as a good Christian king, you need to go retake the Christian Holy Land and drive these Muslim infidels out. So the crusading knights of the Middle Ages went to the Holy Land. And over about the next 200 years, Jerusalem changed hands between Islam and Christianity, until finally, ultimately, the Crusaders went back home and never came back. Well, during the Middle Ages, the Christians kind of had the same attitude that Hamas has now. If you're not one of us, you're a heretic and deserve to die. So the Christians persecuted the Jews. They weren't allowed to own property. They couldn't learn a trade. And the Jews in Europe were basically harassed and treated as outcasts in Europe too. At around the same time that Columbus discovered America, this new group came to power in the Middle East, called the Ottoman Empire. And in 1492, the leader of the Ottoman Empire issued an invitation to the Jews that had been expelled from Jerusalem 1,400 years earlier. If you want to come back, we'll let you come back. And so even though the persecution of the Jews continued in Europe, this new caliph, or whatever his title was, of the Ottoman Empire said, you can come back here if you want. We're not going to bring you here, but if you can make it here, you'll be safe from the Europeans. And over the next couple hundred years, a lot of Jews made their way back to Palestine. Not a lot, but some. And as long as the Ottoman Empire didn't cause any grief with the Europeans didn't care. That's the reason you didn't learn anything about the Ottoman Empire in school, because it didn't really affect European or American history. Not that much. So the Ottomans were basically left alone and left to do their own thing until World War I. In World War I, the Ottomans, sometimes called the Ottoman Turks, joined forces with the Germans. So when the Germans and the Ottomans were defeated in World War I, the League of Nations decided, as the winners, that the Ottomans could no longer be in charge of the Holy Land. And since it was the British who defeated the Ottoman Turks in Palestine, the British troops stayed in Palestine to keep the peace. And the British issued something called the Balfour Declaration. And that was the official declaration by the British for the establishment in Palestine of a national homeland for Jewish people, and that they would not tolerate any violence or persecution against the Jews by the people who were already there, namely the Palestinians. Well, once they did this, more and more Jews began to pour into Palestine. The British continued to call it Palestine. Well, between World War I and World War II, so many Jews had come back to Palestine that they were no longer the minority race in Palestine. The majority of people in Palestine were Jews. And there was a group of people who called themselves Zionists who wanted to make it official and rename the country Israel. Well, needless to say, the people who were there, who are direct descendants of the Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Philistines, didn't like that idea. Why are you renaming it Israel? And so there was a little pushback. But the British already had troops there, and the British had already said, you will not harass these people. You will not perpetrate any violence against these people ever. We intend to keep law and order in Palestine. So the other Palestinians really had a problem with the Zionists and the Zionist movement. But now the Jews were in the majority in Palestine. World War II breaks out. The British have bigger fish to fry than worrying about the little internal squabbles in Palestine. You guys are Muslims. You guys are Jews. Work it out. We need to go fight the Germans again. Well, after World War II, the United Nations, just like after World War I and the League of Nations, the United Nations, after World War II, the winners get to decide who's in charge of what. And any country is welcome to join the United Nations to ensure that this kind of war never happens again. We will police each other to make sure we never have a problem like this again. Well, the Zionists decided, now's our chance. This is the moment we've been waiting for. Now that everybody has heard of the atrocities perpetrated against the Jewish people by the Nazis, the sympathy of the whole world is on our side. Let's make our petition now to become an independent country and call it Israel. Well, the Arab world, namely the Palestinians, said, hold up a second. We were here first. And the Jews said, but God gave this to us. And the Palestinians said, do you have a receipt? Because God told Muhammad that he took it away from you and gave it back to us. And they said, okay, here's what we'll do. This is the United Nations. They said, okay, the area on the west bank of the Jordan River, the east bank of the Jordan River, is the nation of Jordan. They have a king to this day, the king of Jordan. But the west bank is primarily Jordanian Muslims and people who are descended from Palestinians for the last 2,000 years, even though the holy city of Jerusalem was right there. They said, okay, this area of this country is predominantly Muslim, Palestinian, Jordanian descent people. We'll set aside the West Bank area and let you people continue to be Palestinians. Then there was another group in southern Israel that shared a border with Egypt, and most of these people were Egyptian descent Muslims. And there was a heavy concentration of them in a piece of land called the Gaza Strip. So the United Nations passes a resolution and says, okay, we're going to allow you to have your own country called Israel, but you're going to have to set aside the West Bank of the Jordan River for the Palestinians, and this strip of land called the Gaza Strip, that'll also be Palestinian, but you can have everything else. 20 years later, the Israelis decided that the Muslims should not be in charge of the holy city of Jerusalem. It's our holy city, and we want it back. And the Palestinians said, hang on a second. We believe that what you call the Temple Mount is where Muhammad left from when he ascended into heaven. It's our holy city too. Well, a little skirmish broke out that was referred to as the 6-Day War. And the Israelis won. But the Israelis wanted to be fair. And they said, okay, we'll share Jerusalem. And the rest of the Western world, again, didn't care. Because they were too busy fighting the war in Vietnam. Or the Americans were anyway. So that pretty much went with very little notice in the Western European and American world. Well, in the background while all this was happening, there was a fundamentalist Muslim movement that got started. And the way they interpreted the Quran was, anyone who is not one of us is an infidel and deserves death. And we need to drive these Jews that God has turned his back on out of our Holy Land. So there started to be terrorist attacks against Israel. 9/11 was a terrorist attack against the United States because we supported Israel. That's all it took for them to launch a terrorist attack against us. Because the friend of my enemy is also my enemy. And groups like Hamas, which is just a radical terrorist group. They're not the army of the Gaza Strip. They're not the army of the Palestinian people. They are a self-appointed terrorist group who completely believes that the Quran has told them anyone who is not one of us deserves to die. And they became so radicalized that committing suicide would ensure them a place in heaven because they were killing the enemies of God. Hezbollah is just another group, just like Hamas. They just go by a different name. They don't necessarily like Hamas, but they both agree that they have a common enemy, which is the Jews, who must be either exterminated or driven out at all cost. Since 1948, the westernized democracy of Israel has never been able to make peace with the Palestinians because the Palestinians don't want peace. The Palestinians don't want westernized democracy. See, in the Middle East, there is no separation of church and state. The head of the church is the head of the government. or the head of the religion, I should say. They don't call it church. They call it a mosque. But the number one religious leader, who theoretically is the Ayatollah in Iran, is not only head of the religion, he is head of the government. So it's kind of like the same power that the Pope wielded in Europe during the Middle Ages. When the Pope told the Christians, it is your duty to liberate the Holy Land from the infidels. It is your duty to either convert or kill anyone who is not Christian. That was medieval Europe. This is where the Middle East is now. When the Ayatollah says, here's $100 billion that we got from selling oil to the Americans and the Brits and the Chinese and the Russians. Take this $1 billion, buy all the rockets and guns and tanks you can, because it is your duty as a follower and member of the Nation of Islam to drive the infidels out of the Holy Land. And the reason there can be no peace between Israel and Hamas, there can be no negotiation between Israel and Hamas. Israel has nothing to negotiate with. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Taliban, Iran. It's hard to negotiate with someone who tells you that the only thing they want from you is your death. And because Israel is a westernized democracy, they based their government on the governments of Western Europe and America. And they have the same values, or very close to the same values, as the Christians. We won't attack an elementary school. We won't attack an orphanage. We won't attack a hospital. We won't kill innocent people. But see, Hamas doesn't feel that way. Hamas and Hezbollah put their rocket launchers in elementary schools and hospitals and orphanages because they know that these poor, sentimental, stupid Jews won't bomb a hospital. They won't kill innocent women and children, but we know that these women and children are honoring Allah by being our shield so we can continue to fight. That's what they think. That's what they believe. That's why they can't be negotiated with. And what these people in America who are protesting for or on behalf of Hamas and the Palestinians don't know that in the eyes of Hamas and the eyes of the Palestinians, that the Jews are lower than dogs. And Americans are also therefore lower than dogs because they're helping the Jews. They want you dead. They want me dead. They want to kill every white person they can find because they're not Arab. And don't think you're going to make friends with them, because it doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter what your nationality is. If you're not an Arab Muslim of the same group that they are, then you're worthy of death too. They feel no conscience in killing you or me or your children and grandchildren because you are infidels and enemies of God. We are doing God's work. That's what they think. That's what they believe. And that's why you can't negotiate with them. I'm not saying they have always hated the Jews, but this generation of Muslims hates the Jews and anybody who would help the Jews. They hate Christians too. They hate white people. They hate black people. They hate Asian people. But they especially hate the Jews and want to exterminate them, want to kill as many as they can. And they use our laws and our morality against us. They know we won't bomb a hospital, so that's where they put their rocket launchers. They know we won't attack an elementary school, so they build tunnels underneath the elementary school to smuggle in their troops and supplies. When you try to send humanitarian aid to Gaza for the non-combative Palestinians, the Hamas terrorists take it and hide it for their fighters. And as far as they're concerned, their own mothers and daughters and children are expendable as long as it helps their fighters continue to fight. When you see these news stories of these poor Palestinians trying to break into a warehouse because there was food and medical supplies in the warehouse, the Israelis didn't lock the warehouse. Hamas did, because they were saving that food for their fighters. They're saving that medicine and those supplies for their fighters. This terrorist group finally got enough money together to buy bombs and rockets, train their troops in Iran for the last 4 years. They felt like now, while America has a weak president, now is the time to attack Israel and kill as many as we can. There can be no peace between Israel and Hamas. There can be a peace with the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian people are first going to have to turn their backs on the Ayatollah. And until that happens, there is never going to be peaceful coexistence between the Jews and the Nation of Islam. What it's going to take, and it probably won't happen in my lifetime. It may eventually happen. I think it has to happen because I think it's the natural order of things. There has to be a renaissance within the Muslim culture, just like there was a renaissance for the Christians, where the Christians took a hard look at themselves and said, we're barbaric. We have got to stop killing other human beings in the name of Jesus. And during the Renaissance period is when art and science flourished. And people began to take a really hard look at what the Bible actually said, instead of what the religious leaders told us it said. And then the Reformation happened, and the invention of the printing press, where everybody could read the Bible in their own language, and turned to their religious leaders who were encouraging war and killing, and said, this is not what the Bible says. And that whole period was called the Renaissance. Until the Nation of Islam can have a renaissance where they stop listening to their religious leaders and actually read the Quran for themselves and see what it actually says and realize killing other people is not in the Quran. There is no command that says I need to go out and kill people. You religious leaders have been lying to us our whole lives. And start the same kind of revolt that happened in Europe during and just after the Renaissance, where kingdoms were being toppled and the leaders became afraid of the people instead of the people being afraid of the leaders. When soldiers started saying, I'm not going to kill this person just because you told me to. I don't have a grudge against this person. This person never did anything to me. Really never did anything to you. I'm not going to kill him just on your say-so. That's what it's going to take in the Muslim world. But until then, Hamas is going to kill as many Jews as they can. Just because they're Jews. You can't really understand what's going on in Israel right now until you understand the history of who the Israelis are and who Hamas is and understand why they're fighting. And the bottom line is, they're not Christian. They're not like us. They don't think like us. They don't believe in freedom. They believe freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the right to keep and bear arms are all dangerous attitudes. And they think we're crazy. We can't understand fully what's going on over there, even knowing the history, because their culture is so foreign to ours. The things that they're doing right now will never make sense to us because they're not like us. Any group that says it's okay to murder another group of people is not someone to be admired, is not someone to be defended or protested for. Before you stick your head in a lion's mouth, never forget that it's a lion. Before you stick your hand in a basket of rattlesnakes, remember the rattlesnakes. Remember that they don't want to be friends with you, and that they would kill you just as soon as look at you, and they would eat you if they could. Thanks for listening to the podcast. I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you downloading. And don't believe anything I told you. Go look it up for yourself. But I hope this helps you understand a little better what's going on in Israel and why. But go ahead and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and you'll never miss an episode. And the next time I load an episode, you'll get a notification. Thanks again. Talk to you soon. Bye now.